real quick to kind of share an experience I had at work today, which I hadn't experienced in, almost a decade, to be honest with you. So when it happened, it totally took me by surprise. And you usually hear about this with, people, in the media, you hear from other people, but you never think it would be you. And basically, for a lack of better words, I was actually body shamed today, which was, like I said, quite shocking but hilarious at the same time. Basically, I was called a name, kind of, taking jabs at my body type, me being in shape, me having a slim, body build. I'm not too buff or muscular or anything, but at the same time, people can tell I'm fit. So basically, I was in the break room at work, heating up my lunch, and there were two females there, both oversized, having a conversation. Me being the nice guy that I am, I heard them talking about the water filter in the break room and how it was outdated. So I just kind of, leaned in to look at it as well. And they were telling me that they weren't using the microwave. I guess they thought I was waiting to use the microwave, but I wasn't. Well, actually I was, but I was actually also listening to their conversation. It was quite loud, and it sounded like a fun time. They were just kind of making jokes. So I sort of leaned in and said, oh yeah, that's why I don't really drink any water from the job, because of issues like that. So they kept going on and on about some other things, and I should have known it was a toxic situation, because everything being spoken about, was negative basically. So they started talking about the AC, just different things around the building that probably needed replacing or needed to be updated. They were making comments about. And one of the females, she kept going on and on saying, the job should allow us to go back to working from home, being that, if the AC is not going to be working from time to time, she's made a comment that she's too big for that. So like I said, I was laughing the entire conversation from the time I walked in, because, it was a funny conversation, the comments they were making. But I think what happened is that she mistook my constant giggling for me laughing at her body size. And like I said, let's get it straight. She was the one that made a comment about herself. I thought she was joking. She said, I'm too big for this, to be sitting in a hot building all day with no AC working. So I was just kind of giggling, not at the fact at her body size. I've seen this woman before. I've seen her around the building. But I was just laughing at the entirety of the conversation. But I basically spoke to her insecurity, and like I said, this individual, they've seen me before out and around the job. As you've seen in some of my previous videos, we do have some calisthenic devices at my job, luckily. And sometimes I'll go out there on break or on lunch and, do a couple of pull-ups and, whatsoever else. So she's seen me do this. And she also walks with another individual, the both are heavy set, for a lack of better words. So it just kind of reminded me that, well, let's back up a little bit. The comment she made, and like I said, it was quite funny. So when I was giggling the entire time and she made the comment about her weight, and she saw me continuing to giggle, she looked at me quickly and said, "And what are you laughing at, Slim Jim?" And I think it kind of caught everybody in the break room off guard. And like I said, it was just totally shocking, because I have had comments made about my body type, but they've mostly been positive. I've had people come up to me saying that, hey, I've seen you've been working out for so long and see the improvement you've made, and it's actually motivated me to get in shape. Or people have come up to me saying, oh man, I need to work out with you, because they see how fit I am, or just general compliments about my body in general, saying I look good, which that's not my motive for working out or staying in shape. I do it for my own, mental state. I do it to be able to, just do normal things, in life, be able to pick up things, be able to play with my kids, just be able to be functional. So I'm not out there looking for comments. But like I said, people have come up to me making positive comments. So when I heard this, it was almost like, For one, I already knew what it was, being that she was a heavyset female. It was already based on the insecurity. Second, I said, well, maybe it was my fault because I was giggling when she made that comment about herself, but I didn't force her to comment on her body structure or size. So I had to realize that wasn't my fault. That was the insecurity. And basically the point I'm getting to is that you would be astonished at the amount of people that will see you as a fit individual, and it automatically stirs up some insecurity, judgment, or jealousy within them. And I actually have to say that yes, I have had other comments made indirectly. Mostly it wasn't specifically geared towards me, but I've had comments about my body structure being out running with no shirt on. I've heard comments, I've heard people say, oh, you must be looking for attention, being out here with no shirt. Just ridiculous, ignorant comments at the end of the day. So it's just amazing that it helps me realize that it's a kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation when you're in shape, because when you're obviously walking around overweight, people perceive you as lazy. And this is what, the science says. It's not something I'm making up. People perceive you as lazy, that you can't control your eating or whatsoever. So they shame you for that. If you're too muscular, people are saying, oh, he's on some type of juice. He's doing something, some type of steroids or something like that. When you're in shape like me, you don't have too much muscle and people can definitely tell that you're not unhealthy. That's another issue. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. So I guess the moral of the story is, if whether you're starting out on your fitness journey, it's something you're leaning to on a regular basis, or you've been consistent with it for, over the years, don't go out there, looking for people's acceptance or agreement with what you're doing. Just keep doing it for the reason that you need to, have a better life, maintain your health, be able to still be able to walk and run after a certain age, do simple things like lift heavy groceries, just anything, everything but besides looking for the attention and approval from people. Because this is what I tell my sons, is that one thing in this world is that you're always going to be let down when you're seeking people's approval or acceptance. You can go out there and 100 people will be on your side. They'll love you. But it's going to be that one person that'll shatter that reality and have something negative to say. And you can't doubt your journey or what you're doing at that moment just because you got one negative comment. And if anything, it goes to show that you're doing something right. Because we have a saying, in the community that, hey, if I'm not doing something right, then so nobody would be hating on me, basically. So I just wanted to share that story, and if you're overweight, if you have issues with yourself, who's stopping you from going out there doing what you need to do? Who's stopping you from changing your diet? Going to the gym, doing some type of workout? Because like I said, I've seen this individual walk around the track, at our job, but it's here in between. It's not a constant thing they're doing. So that's another thing. People will start something and they don't see the immediate results, so they'll quickly stop. They'll give up on it. But don't look at the individual that's been consistent for years with what they're doing and judge them or be insecure about yourself because of them. Like I said in a previous video, people like me, you don't know what I've been through. You see the muscle, you see the abs. People tend to think, oh, that's something quick, that's something that happened overnight, and it's something that took years upon years, to achieve. And I'm not going to go back into depth about that because I did a video on this whole thing, but people like to judge you based on that snapshot. And it's like, at one point, I wasn't even looking like this. My gut was hanging over my belt. I couldn't run more than a few feet down the street. Oh, just all types of issues. I was eating junk food, candy, you know, uh, cakes and stuff, ice cream, whatsoever. So you don't know what I had to deal with mentally to get to the point that I am now. Yet you're judging me based off of a snapshot and, calling me a name because you felt insecure about yourself. So nobody's, like I said, nobody's stopping people who feel some type of way about themselves. Nobody's stopping you from doing what you have to do. You know, even if you're out here saying, well, my weight is linked to a health condition. Hey, I'm not an advocate for this, but there's plenty of people out here doing the Wegovy and all types of other medications to lose weight. And I've seen people walking around to where it works. So if you have to go to that extreme because you feel so insecure about yourself, do that. But don't walk around and judge the people that are fit. Naturally humans are supposed to be fit. you know, our ancestors weren't sitting around, obese and, having these multiple health conditions related, to being obese. We're supposed to be naturally fit. So like I said, I just wanted to give my little, spill on that. And for all the people that's on their fitness journey, keep going at it. Do it for the right reasons. And just don't care about anybody's judgment. But peace.